Story 1. The Man in the Woods. I grew up in a small Appalachian town, the kind of place where the forest stretched endlessly, where the mountains felt alive, and where the woods were both a playground and a mystery. My best friend Kyle and I spent our childhood exploring the dense trails behind my grandparents' house, trekking through the underbrush, and discovering the forgotten remnants of a past that no one seemed to talk about. Old stone foundations, rusting cars swallowed by vines, and even a crumbling cabin deep in the woods. It felt like our own secret world, untouched by time. But one summer, something changed. It started with Kyle acting strange, saying he felt like someone was watching us. I laughed it off at first, but then I started feeling it too. That creeping sensation that something unseen was just beyond the trees, standing perfectly still, waiting. Then came the footprints. One evening, we found them on our usual trail, deep impressions in the dirt, unmistakably human, but barefoot. And they weren't old. The edges were crisp, like they had been made that very day. But what unsettled us most was where they led, straight into the trees, toward the abandoned cabin. And there were no prints leading away. Something or someone had walked into that cabin and never left. I don't know why I felt the need to follow them. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity, but Kyle tried to stop me, saying it felt wrong. But I was already moving, stepping carefully through the underbrush, each footstep feeling heavier as I neared the old structure. The cabin stood rotting, swallowed by the forest, its windows like empty eye sockets staring back at us. The door was slightly ajar. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath my weight. The air was thick, suffocating, silent. And then, from inside the cabin, came a sound. A single, deliberate knock. My heart slammed against my ribs. Kyle whispered my name, voice trembling, but I couldn't move. Another knock. Slow, rhythmic, like something was waiting for me to open the door. My breath hitched. The air felt electric, charged with something unseen, something wrong. And then, just as I took a step back, something inside moved. Not a shuffle, not the creak of old wood shifting, but the unmistakable sound of a barefoot step. That was enough. I turned and ran, bolting off the porch so fast I nearly tripped, Kyle right behind me. We sprinted all the way back to my grandparents' house, but even when we were inside, doors locked, I still felt it, that awful, bone-deep certainty that something was still watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom window faced the woods, and long after everyone had gone to bed, I lay frozen beneath my blankets, listening. And then, just past midnight, I heard it. Faint, distant, whistling. A slow, eerie tune carried through the trees. I told my grandfather about it the next morning, about the footprints, the cabin, the knocking. I expected him to brush it off, to say we were imagining things. But instead, his face darkened. He didn't ask for details, didn't lecture me, just asked one simple question. You didn't go inside, did you? I told him no. He exhaled, nodding slowly. Good. I pressed him, asked why. He wouldn't answer, just muttered something I'll never forget. Some things in these woods ain't meant to be found. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Kyle and I sat on the back porch, watching the tree line. Neither of us spoke about the cabin. But then Kyle tensed. His breath hitched. Do you see that? I followed his gaze, my stomach twisting. A figure stood just beyond the trees. Tall, thin, barefoot, watching. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there perfectly still. My skin went cold. The air felt heavy, thick like molasses. And then, as if it knew we were looking, it slowly lifted a hand and waved. Not a friendly wave, not a greeting. It was slow, deliberate mocking. We bolted inside, slamming the door, locking every latch. My grandfather didn't ask why. He just walked to the windows and pulled down the blinds. That night, I lay awake, every muscle tense, heart hammering in my chest. The house was quiet, but the weight of something unseen pressed against the walls, against the windows. And then, just as sleep finally started to take me, I heard it again. Closer this time. Clearer. A slow, deliberate whistle right outside my window. I bury my head under the blankets, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. By morning, the sound was gone. The woods looked the same as they always had, but I never set foot in them again. I left for college, moved away, and years passed. But when I came back to visit one summer night, I found myself sitting on that same back porch, staring at the trees. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was all just childhood fear, that nothing was out there. And then, just as I turned to go inside, I heard it, soft, slow, drifting from the woods, whistling. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was out there that summer had never left, and it was still waiting. Story 2. The thing that knocked back. I grew up in a house nestled deep in the Appalachian Hills, where the forest crept right up to the backyard, and the nights were so dark you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. My family had lived there for generations, and I always felt safe until the summer I turned 16. That was the summer I stopped sleeping with my window open. The summer I started locking my door at night. The summer I learned that when something in the woods knocks, you don't knock back. It started small, little things I ignored at first. Twigs snapping just beyond the tree line when no one was there, the occasional rustling outside my window, the feeling of being watched even when I was alone. I chalked it up to paranoia, to my imagination running wild. But then, one night, I heard it for the first time. A single, deliberate knock against my bedroom window. My room was on the second floor. My stomach dropped. I sat up, staring at the window, my breath shallow. The glass reflected nothing but the inky darkness outside. My curtains swayed slightly, caught in a breeze that wasn't there. I told myself it was the wind, even though it hadn't sounded like the house settling or a tree branch scraping against the siding. It had been distinct, a solid, intentional knock. The next morning, I checked outside. There was nothing below my window but undisturbed dirt and the thick roots of the old oak tree. No ladder, no marks, no footprints. I told myself I'd imagined it. Until the next night. The knock came again. Same slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 beats, soft but undeniable. This time, I didn't move. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for it to go away. But instead, after a long pause, I heard something worse. A whisper, muffled, just barely audible, as though spoken through the glass. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was strange, low and rasping, like the speaker had spent years breathing in smoke. My chest seized. I wanted to scream, to run to my parents' room, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I lay there, frozen, as the whispering faded into silence. The next morning, I found something outside. Directly beneath my window, half buried in the dirt, was a small, hand-carved wooden figure. It was crude but unmistakable, a twisted little effigy of a human shape, its limbs too long, its face featureless. I picked it up, feeling the rough splinters bite into my palm. Something about it made my skin crawl. My grandmother saw me holding it and immediately snatched it from my hand, throwing it into the fire without a word. When I asked why, her face was pale. "You don't acknowledge it," she said. "You never acknowledge it." That night, the knocking came again. Louder this time, more forceful. And this time, something scratched against the glass. Long, deliberate drags like nails or claws. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I lay there, heart hammering, as the scratching stopped and the knocking resumed. 3 slow, measured beats. My throat was dry. My entire body screamed at me to stay silent. But something in me snapped. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was pure stupidity. But before I could stop myself, I raised my hand and I knocked back. The second my knuckles hit the wall, the entire room seemed to go still. The air turned thick, suffocating. The silence stretched long enough that I almost believed, almost hoped, that whatever was outside had gone. And then, bang, something massive slammed into the window, shaking the glass so hard I thought it would shatter. I flinched, rolling out of bed, scrambling backward until I hit the opposite wall. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The thing outside breathed. A low, rasping exhale, deep and unnatural. Then slowly it knocked back. My door burst open, and my grandmother stormed in, her face twisted in fury and fear. She didn't say a word. She just grabbed my arm, dragged me away from the window, and shoved me down the hall. I was too shaken to resist. She made me sleep in the living room that night, the fire roaring, every door and window locked. I didn't argue. The next day, she took me out into the woods, deeper than I had ever gone before. We stopped at an old, hollowed-out tree, its bark carved with strange symbols. She pulled something from her pocket, a small bag of what looked like ashen bone, and stuffed it inside the hollow, whispering under her breath the whole time. When she was done, she turned to me, her grip firm on my wrist. "You never knock back," she said. "Do you understand?" "Never." I nodded, too afraid to ask questions. That night, the knocking didn't come. The whispers didn't return, but I still couldn't sleep, because as I lay in the flickering firelight, I realized something chilling. The thing outside my window hadn't been trying to get in. It had been trying to see if I would let it in. And when I knocked back, I had answered. I left for college a few years later, moved far away from those mountains. But even now, sometimes in the dead of night, I wake up to a sound in the distance. A slow, deliberate knock. And I squeeze my eyes shut, my body rigid, because I know it's waiting to see if I'll knock back. Story 3. The staircase that went nowhere. I grew up in a small Appalachian town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the mountains were both a home and a warning. My father was a park ranger. I spent my childhood wandering the trails, learning how to read the land, how to respect it. But there was one thing my father always told me, his voice serious in a way that made my stomach twist. If you ever find a staircase in the woods, you turn around. You never, ever climb it. I thought it was just another one of his strange superstitions, like whistling at night or leaving salt at the doorstep. But then, one summer when I was 17, I saw one for myself. And I've never been the same since. It was early August, and I had gone hiking alone, something I'd done 100 times before. The sun was high, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. I had been walking for hours, following a narrow deer trail deep into the forest when I saw it. The trees parted slightly in a small clearing, and there, standing in the middle of nothing, was a staircase. It looked completely out of place, old and weathered but strangely intact, like it had been plucked from a house and dropped in the middle of the woods. There were about 15 steps leading up to nothing. No platform, no railing, no sign of what it had once been attached to. Just stairs standing alone. A chill ran down my spine. I shouldn't be here. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. But something about it pulled at me, an unnatural curiosity settling in my bones. My father's warning echoed in my head, but it felt distant now, like a voice through water. I stepped closer. The air around the staircase felt different, heavier, quieter. The usual sounds of the forest had disappeared. No birds, no insects, just thick, suffocating silence. I swallowed, reaching out to touch the wood. It was smooth, too smooth, as if time hadn't touched it at all. My fingers tingled, my breath shallow. And then, without thinking, I placed my foot on the first step. The moment my weight settled, everything changed. The silence became deafening, pressing against my skull. The air grew thick, humming with something unseen. I could feel in my bones, in my teeth, a static charge that made my vision swim. I should have stopped. I should have turned back. But I took another step, and another. My body felt light, disconnected, like I was floating. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I couldn't stop. By the time I reached the 10th step, I felt something shift, like the very fabric of the world had stretched thin around me. The trees looked wrong, twisted, taller than they should be. The sky above was a color I couldn't name. Not quite blue, not quite gray. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, distant but constant, burrowing into my skull. And then I heard it. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A voice right behind me. "Don't turn around." I froze. My body locked in place, muscles rigid. The voice was right there at my ear, but I hadn't heard anyone approach. The wind didn't shift. The steps hadn't creaked. And yet, something was behind me. Standing close. Too close. My breathing was shallow, panic clawing at my throat. I wanted to run, to bolt down the stairs, but I couldn't move. The voice came again, soft and wrong, curling into my brain like smoke. "You shouldn't be here." A cold hand touched my shoulder. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was standing on the staircase, my body locked in terror, and then I was falling. A rush of air, a violent pull, my stomach flipping inside out. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. My vision swam, my head ringing. When I blinked, I was back in a clearing. The staircase was gone. The forest was normal again, alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But I didn't feel normal. Something inside me had shifted. Something was wrong. I stumbled home, my body aching, my mind foggy. I didn't tell my father. I wanted to. I almost did. But when I looked at him, at the deep lines in his face, at the way he glanced toward the woods with quiet wariness, I knew he already knew. And he would never ask. That night, I dreamed of the staircase, of the thing that had been behind me. I didn't see its face. I never saw its face. But I could feel it, its breath against my skin, its fingers pressing into my shoulder. And worst of all, the whisper that came just before I woke up. You came back wrong. I left home a year later, but the dreams never stopped. Sometimes, I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of a hand on my shoulder, the high-pitched ringing in my ears. And sometimes when I pass by a staircase, any staircase, I feel it again. That pull, that wrongness, like something is waiting, like I never really left. And worst of all, sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still, I hear the voice. Closer now, right behind me. Don't turn around.